So in the last segment, I introduced empiricist and rationalist approaches to modality, explained the distinction between a modal ontology and a modal epistemology, and explained the dilemma, the puzzle that faces us, trying to choose between these two approaches, given that each seems like it has a pretty serious drawback. In this briefer segment, we're just going to sketch out the rationalist and the empiricist approaches in a little more detail. And we're going to do that largely in order to, this is sort of a bit of history of philosophy. I want you to see that Descartes did indeed advocate something like what we're calling the rationalist approach, and Hume did indeed advocate something like what we're calling the empiricist approach. So here's Descartes. He says, even if there are not and never were any triangles outside my thought, still, when I imagine a triangle, I am constrained in how I do this, because there is a determinate nature or essence or form of triangle that is eternal, unchanging, and independent of my mind. So he's claiming here that there's an essence to triangle, and that essence, he thinks, determines how I think about it. But the point is, it precedes how I think about it. It's independent of my mind. He's advancing a realist ontology for essences, and correspondingly for necessity and possibility. He continues. He says, the fact that I can vividly and clearly think of one thing apart from another assures me that the two things are distinct from one another. This is a central premise, by the way, in his argument for mind-body dualism. It's called the real distinction argument. And one of the premises says, I can vividly and clearly think of mind apart from body. Another premise says, if I can vividly and clearly think of mind apart from body, then the two are distinct. And that's what he's asserting here, the general claim. He continues, that is, it assures me that they are two if I can think of them as coming apart. Never mind how they could be separated, that is, how it could actually happen in our world, that does not affect the judgment that they are distinct. So if you can think of them as distinct, then they are distinct, even if they run together in our world. And this is, as I said, crucial in his argument for mind-body dualism. He thinks the mind and body are run together in our world, but since you can think of them as separating, they're in principle separable. They're not identical to one another. Here's another passage, and now we're going to get the sort of epistemology first and the ontology second. He says, from the fact that I cannot think of God except as existing, it follows that existence is inseparable from God. So he's saying here that from the fact that he can only conceive of things one way, it follows that they are necessarily that way. And now he's going to assert the realist ontology. He says, it is not that my thought makes this so. My thought doesn't impose any necessity on the thing. So his intuition, the concepts, his thinking isn't what makes the modal claim at issue true. On the contrary, it is the necessity of the thing itself, that is, the necessity had mind independently, namely the existence of God, which determines my thinking in this respect. So he's trying to make you a bit more comfortable with the idea that intuition can provide a guide to mind-independent necessity and possibility by saying that if things are necessarily a certain way, then that will impose on your mind a certain kind of necessity. I don't think this actually helps with the epistemological puzzle. I just want you to see he's not sort of completely insensitive to it. And more importantly, I want you to see that he does indeed advocate a realist modal ontology, as he's doing in the second passage on the right here, and a intuition-based or conceiving-based modal epistemology, as he does in the first paragraph on the right. Okay, so now let's look at Hume's approach. Here's an argument that you can find in Hume. He says, you can't sense necessity. Okay, and here's a quote, when we look about us toward external objects and consider the operation of causes, causal connection being a kind of not metaphysically but physically necessary connection. So when we look about us toward external objects and consider the operation of causes, we are never able, in a single instance, to discover any power or necessary connection. So the idea is, to use an example that Hume used, when you see the cue ball strike the 8-ball, and then the 8-ball move, and the cue ball maybe go off in another direction or slow down or whatever, you presume that the cue ball striking the 8-ball caused the 8-ball to move. But you can't see the causation. You can't see the necessity of the connection, that the one event follows the other event. Instead, you just see one event follow the other event. And then he continues, there's nothing in any number of instances different from every single instance. So what does he mean here? Suppose you hit the cue ball in exactly the same way 1,000 times, and the 8 ball moves in exactly the same way 1,000 times. It's not like on the first go around you don't see causation, but by the 10th go around, your perception includes causation. That is, causation is right there in your perceptual experience. Instead, what happens, he thinks, is that after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant and to believe that it will exist. So what happens is, by the 10th time you see the cue ball hit the 8 ball in a particular way, and the 8 ball go off in the same direction that it did the first time, and the cue ball go off in the same direction that it did the first time, you then start to think, okay, there's a necessary connection here. And one kind of necessary connection is a causal connection. But the point is, you're not getting that from perception. You're getting it from, he thinks, a habit of the mind to when A and B are paired often enough, when cue ball striking 8 ball and movement occurring in a certain way are paired often enough, to expect the one upon the other. So you expect B when A occurs. You expect the 8 ball to move in a certain way when the cue ball strikes it. He continues, this connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of necessary connection. So this is where the origin of the concept of necessity comes. Nothing farther is in the case. That is, there is no necessity, there's no real necessity out there in the world, there's just our habit of mind. And that's what necessity reduces to, is a certain kind of habit of mind. Well, if you can't sense necessity, and he thinks you can't, then either beliefs about necessity are unjustified, because perception is how we can justify beliefs, or necessity is mind-dependent. So why does he think this? Remember, as an empiricist, Hume rejects substantive a priori knowledge. He thinks all substantive knowledge, knowledge of the way the world is, comes from perception. And that sort of makes sense, because the world is out there separate from us. How are we going to access it? It's going to causally impinge on us. And that's what perception is. It's the sort of causal impingement of the world on us. So if you can't sense necessity, there's just two options. One is beliefs about it are unjustified because they purport to be sort of substantive beliefs, and you can't have such beliefs since you can't get them through sensation. Or necessity itself is mind-dependent. It's nothing but sort of a mental habit. That is, we adopt the mentalist modal ontology. So here's roughly the idea. Hume thinks that beliefs that arise from outward impressions, this is his language here, can be both justified and about the world. We could just say beliefs that arise from perceptions can be both justified and about the world. But beliefs that arise from inward impressions, these are sort of non-perceptual phenomenal experiences, non-perceptual conscious experiences, are either unjustified or about mentality. So we get the conclusion that either beliefs about necessity can't be justified or necessity is mind-dependent. Well, he thinks beliefs about necessity can be justified, and therefore they must be about the mind. Here's a passage. He says, when we say, therefore, that one object is necessarily connected with the other, we mean only that they have acquired a connection in our thought. So when he says we mean only that they have acquired a connection in our thought, what he's saying is the truth makers for claims about necessity are these kinds of connections in our thought. So we get the conclusion that necessity is mind-dependent. And that's Hume's approach. So I want you to see now that Hume does indeed adopt empiricism, Descartes does indeed adopt rationalism, and as per the previous segment, there's an advantage to each approach. The fit between the ontology and the epistemology is poor for the rationalist. The ontology itself is poor for the empiricist. So each side has some undesirable characteristic. Okay, and we're going to stop that segment there. Stop this segment there. In the next segment, we'll talk about both Kant and Quine's approaches to modality. But before we do that, in the next segment, I'll explain why it is that a realist modal ontology is desirable and a mentalist modal ontology isn't.